Hi, and welcome to the Long Range Shooting and Custom Rifle Building podcast presented by Wolf Precision Incorporated, where we learn about and share long range shooting and custom rifle building. I am your host, Jamie Dotson, and welcome to the show. Hi, and welcome to episode 30 of Wolf Precision's Long Range Shooting and Custom Rifle Building podcast. My name is Jamie Dotson. I am your host, and we are really excited about this podcast because in this one, we finally get to talk to master action builder and owner of Bat Machine Company, Bruce A. Thom. So I tell you, this is a great opportunity to sit and listen to probably one of the best custom action makers in the country and maybe in the world, and listen to some of the things that they do with their actions and for their actions. A lot of things that, comes from his background. So it was a fantastic interview. I really appreciated, getting a chance to get Bruce on here. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Mr. Bruce A. Thom of Bat Machine. So I'd like to introduce Mr. Bruce A. Thom, owner of BAT Machine, to the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Bruce.
Morning, Jamie.
I know it's been a little while trying to get you on here. Everybody's been really busy, but I am super excited to do this interview. I really think you have so much to offer. Your knowledge in the industry, your background, your history, world-class machinist, all of this great stuff to talk about and to sort of share with everybody that's listening. But right out of the gate, though, I do have to ask you a personal question. What really drives you? Like, what's something that just gets you out of bed every morning and keeps you pumped to keep going after this? And what makes Bruce when it comes to in business and in what you're doing with your actions?
Mostly I like creating new stuff, coming up with new ideas, and trying to make them the best that they can be. I've always been a person that likes to create things. My mom says that I started when I was a little boy, always wanting to make stuff.
And when you get into the gun world, what's your history? I mean, what got you started into, building custom rifles? I know I read a book a long time ago called The Varmint Hunter's Odyssey, and it talked a little bit about your history, and I thought that was pretty cool, but it had a very early picture of you with what looked like to be a handmade rifle, and it talked about that rifle. But how long have you been building rifles, and what got you started in it?
Well, honestly, it's my mom's fault. She wouldn't let Dad buy me a 22 when I wanted one when I was probably about 8 years old. And so I had to do with the BB gun, and then, of course, made some toy rifles. And Dad had a hacksaw and, some files and a little drill press. And so by the time I was about, I think it was around 12 or 13, I'd been making knives for quite a while by then. And so I successfully made like kind of a break open action in a 22 rimfire. And then when I got into high school machine shop, I discovered the high school machine shop. I was like, cool, now I can make some really nice guns. So yeah, actually when I discovered that there was actually machine tools that you could make this stuff on, I was pretty well hooked for life on machining metal, and specifically with an emphasis towards making guns.
How old were you when you made that first 22?
I got it finished when I was 14.
That is awesome. And then once you figured out the machining part of it, it was off to the races?
Yeah, I think I believe I made 4 complete rifles in high school machine shop before my senior year. And then my senior year, I dedicated to making a milling machine because I was able to afford. I'd been saving up money for a dirt bike, and I ended up spending that money for to get my first metal lathe. So I had a lathe at home, so I could do my barrel work at home, but I didn't have a mill. So I spent my senior year building a milling machine, and then went after high school, went to trade school for machinist, and then went into tool making, specifically mold making, and spent 12 years doing that. But always had my shop at home and always building guns for myself. And really what got me into extreme accuracy was ground squirrels. I was always trying to hit them little buggers further and further away, and that takes an accurate rifle because they're not very big.
As a varmint hunter, I remember talking, Daryl works there at the shop with you, that's your brother, and we were talking about this new lab radar, and that you were disappointed in it, and that you probably weren't going to buy one because it wouldn't allow you to read bullets over 4,000 feet per second. Is that a true story?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't actually tried it, but yeah, several of my varmint calibers, like my 20 PPC and my 17 Mach 4, are right at that 4,000 feet per second level. So I'm still using my old style screen type chronographs. And he uses his fancy lab radar and swears at it all the time because it doesn't always pick up his bullets.
I often find that like varmint hunters are a different breed because they get hooked into this accuracy, because hitting stuff at long distance that's small is just super hard. But can you share with us maybe one of the craziest calibers that you built for yourself while you're working up through and trying to hit these things further and further out?
Yeah, so I started out building bolt guns in high school and built a few more, I think first year of trade school. And then I'm always a person that likes a challenge. And the one thing that was always in the gun magazines of the day, it was like, oh yeah, single shot falling block actions. They make a nice short rifle, but they're not very accurate. You can't get real good accuracy out of them. So I took that as a challenge and started making falling block actions. Actually, I think I started my first one when I was still in high school. And what I did was made sure I made the receiver tenon area a little bit longer so I could hang my scope and stock completely free floater to the barrel. And so in that process, first one I built was a 222, and I was quite disappointed in the long range ability of that thing. So then I jumped to a 6BR. I wasn't real impressed with it either. And so I was like, okay, 22 Cheetah. That thing looks like it ought to be a Hummer. So I built a 22 Cheetah. And let me tell you what, that is extreme overkill on ground squirrels.
What bullet were you shooting out of it?
55 grain nozzle ballistic tips at a little over 4,000 feet a second.
Oh, that is awesome. Now, I have to go back. Building rifles in high school, machine shop.
Yeah.
That is something that would be probably land or poor teenagers now in jail for a minimum of 7 to 21 years. So you're actually building the rifles in high school in the machine shop. Right.
So the condition was that they let me build the receivers, but I couldn't install the barrel on it. So that was the driving factor to get my own lathe at home, to do my barreling at home. And you got to understand, I had no mentors. I didn't have anybody I knew that was a gunsmith. Everything I figured out was on my own and what I could glean from reading, which was, in those days, there wasn't much because there was no internet. So it was kind of figured out on your own, which is kind of the way I always have been. And I guess that's really what keeps me learning. I really don't I don't spend any time looking at what other people do. I'm always trying to figure out how to do it my way, even if I do see somebody else has done it. There's always a different way, or usually a better way.
One of the most fascinating things to sit down and talk with you about is when you're working on a project. It's really cool to see how your mind works and where it starts to go and how you're starting to root through things. And I mean, it's just comes from being a world-class machinist and someone who likes to tinker, I guess.
Well, part of that mindset really got developed as a tool maker. I mean, I always had a mentality for problem solving and figuring things out, but the shops I worked for in mold making were generally smaller shops, and we didn't always have a complete tool design. We'd have a tool layout that would come from the tool designer. He'd kind of figured out what size the tool needed to be, and where he wanted the gates and such in the part. But as far as a complete tool design with all the dimensions on it, it wasn't there. We were given the final part that the tool was supposed to manufacture, and basically work backwards from there. And that really makes you think when you're thinking not only in reverse of mirror image of what you're making, but also you have to factor in shrink factors and such for the different plastics you're building the tools for. And that really gets your problem solving tuned up.
How old is Bat Machine Company? I mean, how long ago did you start the company? What got your interest in starting it, first of all? But then how long have you been around making custom actions?
So the first actions I made for sale were actually the falling block. I got my first FFL in 1990. I'm still tool making, but was building. I built about a dozen rifles, falling block rifles, between 1990 and it must have been about 93. And then one of my customers that had bought one of the falling blocks was a local guy, and one day he brought by a pickup full of bench rest rifles. Back of his pickup must have had a half a dozen bench rest rifles in it. And I took a look at those and I was like, I got to have one. But of course, I'm going to make it and make my own action and everything. And so that got me interested in bench rest, really understanding what the level of accuracy was at the competitive bench rest level. I think that was around 93, and between himself and a couple other local guys, when they found out I was going to build some bolt guns, they ordered them. And they were people that talked to other gunsmiths around the country. And pretty soon I started getting orders for these bench rest actions I was building for myself and a couple local guys. And it got to the point where I was working 50 hours a week at my tool making job, and evenings till 1 a.m. at home, and Saturdays. And finally I was like, well, see if we can actually make a business out of this. And that was incorporated Bat Machine in 1996. And so, yeah, been doing it full time since January 1st of 1996.
And back in that time, I'd been shooting and varmint hunting back then. I don't remember. I mean, I know bench rest had some custom action builders. It was pretty common for guys just to true stuff. But when you first started this, how many other custom action makers were there out there at the time? I mean, compared to today, there's just everybody with the CNCs popping up and making stuff. But back when you started this, how many people were really at that level building that level of action?
Well, honestly, nobody. Not really. Kelby's and Alan Hall will take objection to that. But Kelby's and Alan Hall were the only two that were building bench rest specific actions. By that time, Wichita had kind of faded off. They had made some bench rest actions for a while. And you're right. There was quite a few Remington 700s trued and sleeved that were still lurking around in bench rest. At about the same time, Glenn Harrison of Nasika Bay also started making an action, and he was just getting going at the same time I was. And actually, I met Glenn in 94 at a bench rest match in Tacoma, and he was shooting a Stoll Panda at that time. But by, I think, around 96, he had started making his own actions as well. That was it. And part of the reason I got my foot in the door at that time with the bench rest shooters was Kelby's actions were aluminum. And there was a lot of bench rest shooters that didn't like aluminum because Kelby's didn't do anything to harden the surfaces, like hard anodizing. Mm-hmm. And so the bolt body bores would wear out. You know, the bench rest shooters will wear out a couple barrels a season. The good guys even more. And so a lot of cycling of the bolt and that aluminum they tended to get pretty loose after a few years. And then Alan Hall, he made a full diameter style bolt, and some people just didn't like that. Some people did. And his volume was he didn't make a large volume of them, and his personality didn't set well with some people, and so kind of left a place to get your foot in the door.
When you first started this process of developing them, what was some of the harder things or some of the challenges that you faced?
So really the most difficult part is the raceways. That's the most difficult part to machine. Back at that time, wire EDM was relatively new, even in tool making. There weren't too many shops that had them, and they were really slow and really expensive. So I built my first tooling, broach tooling to broach the raceways, and then eventually took those designs to a broach manufacturer and tweaked them and came up with broach. We broached our raceways for years. As far as a couple of things that were my requirements on building a precision bench rest action, I was used to working with hard materials. That's tool making, mold making. It's always almost hardened, pre-hardened, or hardened and then machined materials. So I was used to working with those kind of materials, and to keep distortion to a minimum, I did not want to heat treat afterwards. So all of our actions have always been machined from hardened bar stock to the hardness level that I thought and think is the most appropriate for each component. So that's another challenge, if you will, especially in those days. The tooling wasn't where it's at today. Mm-hmm. And also everything was done on manual equipment. We did get our first CNC in 1997, first CNC mill, and then in 98 we bought our first CNC lathe. But prior to all those first actions were all manually machined, and every bit as good as what we make on the CNC machine, just very slow.
Can you walk us through the step-by-step process, not in huge detail, but when you're making an action, how many processes you have to go through before you wind up with an end product that's the receiver?
I don't know if I should tell you all that. Basically, the first thing the steel does is comes in, gets cut to a blank length, gets heat treated, and then we pop a hole through it. The bore and raceways are machined, and then the OD of the blank is trued up to that bore. The bore is always our reference plane. Yeah, and then it goes through. Let's see. So we go through heat treat. 1, 2, 3 operations before it gets threaded. And then after it's threaded, it goes through 3 more operations. And you got to understand that depending on the shop, that might be more than that many operations. But the one thing to achieve accuracy is the more you can do in a setup, the less times you have to move the part, the better you can hold the concentricity and the relative dimensions to other dimensions. So all of our setups are designed to do as much machining as possible in that operation.
So you're not constantly resetting up the part in another fixture and dialing it in and starting to cut again.
That's right.
And does it take just as long to do the bolt? Now, we got a video coming out. You've developed a 2-piece bolt that I think is just awesome. The fit of how these pieces fit together is absolutely incredible. But I look at the bolt and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, he's probably got as much time making the bolt as he does the action itself. Does it take almost as long? I mean, to you manufacture then the bolt as a separate entity, I can't imagine how much time that actually takes in the operations as well.
Right. It is an equal amount of time, especially when you figure the components to go in, the bolt firing pin, the shroud, and extractors, ejectors. Yeah, it's every bit as equivalent, and the setups are every bit as picky. It's not exactly. I mean, it seems like a very simple thing to get a perfectly square true bolt, and it is in a way, but it really takes a lot of attention to detail on the setup and the quality of your tooling to actually achieve that on the production based. Although we're not nearly as big of a production as some shops, and probably part of that is because we've always held really close tolerances. Our actions from 1997 till today in the specific model are still the same headspace, still the same thread tenon size and length. I mean, you can literally take an action from 1997, screw a barrel from that action onto one made today, and the headspace will be the same. I mean, within a half a thousandths.
That's actually incredible. And before I forget, I want to go back because I want to ask you a couple more questions about that. One of the things that fascinated me, like I used to true Remington 700s. I would sleeve them, in essence, sleeving the bolts, tighten up the bolt bore raceway to get rid of that slop. And the idea behind that was to have good lock up on both your lugs on the bolt.
Top and bottom. Mm-hmm.
One of the things that absolutely fascinated me, so we were building on lots of different actions. Customers would send in actions from about, anybody that they could buy them from. And I actually got tired of, I would check this. I would measure the bolt bore raceway. There would be a fair amount of slop in them, but then I would check the contact on the lugs of the bolt. And I was absolutely stunned that here we've got a $1,500 action that only has like 20 or 30% contact on one lug. And so that led me into finding you and getting to know you guys. We had some bench rest actions of yours come through. And one thing that absolutely always fascinated me, and even when we started building with the 700 clones that we have now, is I have no idea how you do this, but you're able to keep that contact on both those lugs. And that's actually not an easy thing to do. And, on top of that, just how important that is that actually is that way.
Yeah, it's very important. You may not notice it on a rifle that doesn't shoot that well, but if you have if everything else on the rifle is right, not having equal lug contact will definitely be a limiting factor on your ability to shoot small groups and have a consistent shooting rifle. So that was another thing that was kind of a pet peeve of mine when I started making actions, was how loose bolt to bore fit was on most actions, including the custom actions that were available at the time. And so On the bench rest actions, we maintained a thousandth clearance to a thousandth and a half for years. We still maintain that clearance. We have opened it up slightly, maybe to a total of 2,000 clearance on the bench rest actions, just because people tend to like to Cerakote stuff once in a while. Mm-hmm. Even that 2,000 is a little too tight. On the repeating actions, we've opened that clearance up to between 3,000, and that seems to be a pretty good compromise. But yeah, part of being able to have both lugs contact when the rifle is in the cocked position and the bolt's in the cocked position is that you don't have a bunch of slop in that bolt body, because the trigger lifts the rear of the bolt up and takes that front lug on the top out of contact with the receiver. Even if it's perfectly square, it'll, it's going to lift it off. And so, yeah, as far as manufacturing the receiver to be square, that's just a matter of the setups you use and how you, fixture everything and attention to detail as it goes through the processes. There's a difference between tolerances and clearances too. Our tolerances are held very close, but we do allow on the repeating actions are held to the same tolerance as our bench rest actions, but there is more clearance in the bolt body.
Can you explain a little bit the difference between the two? I know when we got the first BT or BAT tactical action here, my goal was to run it in the Allegheny Sniper Challenge, and that was in August of 2012. 3-day match in field conditions, really just beat the daylights out of this thing. And the rifle shot just like they always do. I mean, the quality of the actions is the engine of it. And I didn't wipe the bolt body down. We shot in rain, barns, from lofts, dirt, debris, and the rifle ran fantastic. And I ended up winning the match with the prototype rifle, which was just absolutely awesome. But can you explain what that means to customers in the field? Because I find that a lot of people use that. So, for example, when we were talking about the 3,000th clearance, is that 3,000th clearance total or per side?
That's total.
And so I want to stop you right there, because what a lot of other action manufacturers are saying, for example, when we got a particular brand of action years ago, and the bolt bores, the slop in the bolt bore raceway was like 7 or 8 thousandths, and that's equivalent to a Remington 700. And I called the action manufacturer, and I'm like, hey, you're supposed to be 3 thousandths to 3.5 thousandths clearance. This action has 7. And they're like, oh, well, that's 3 thousandths per side. Mm-hmm. And so I just want to throw that out there, that when you're talking about 3 thousandths clearance, you're talking about total. That's 1.5 thousandths clearance per side. Or, to give an example, maybe half the width of a human hair. But explain to people why they work in field conditions, in dirt and debris, because you'll hear a lot of the other action manufacturers that keep these looser tolerances use the excuse that we keep these tolerances because we have to do that, so they run in the field conditions.
Well, I would tend to agree with you a little bit on it being an excuse, but the part of it is the more clearance you have, the more dirt that can get in. So yeah, you need the clearance. If there's a little less clearance, it just tends to wipe off as you're cycling the action. And that is part of the reason we have encouraged people to use the melanite salt bath nitride process, is because not only does it make a really slick action, but it makes them really, it doesn't matter how much dirt you got on it. They stay really free running. It seems like the 3000 has always been enough in the repeating type of rifles to get the job done and not have them seize up. I've never heard of anybody have one seize up with that kind of clearance of our customers. And actually, I have seen some Remingtons that were actually that close. It must have been an accident, and they seem to run just fine too. So yeah, you really don't need the big sloppy bolt, and you really don't want it for accuracy purposes.
So you have a window that you can work within and still maintain proper contact with both lugs. And if you go past that window, you start to sacrifice the accuracy or potential accuracy.
And it's not just lug contact. There's a few other things that happen too when you have huge bolt body clearance to receiver body clearance. And that is the way the whole firing mechanism releases and starts to travel. When I mentioned earlier how the very nature of the firing pin assembly pushing on the trigger before you fire, it lifts the bolt up. And so that tends to, what do you want to say, cause even weird vibrations the more it's lifted up and out of alignment with the firing pin assembly itself as it starts to travel. And that's the other thing that some people really fall short on or don't understand is how important that firing pin assembly is inside the bolt and how it's guided and how the clearance is on those parts. It's really important for consistent ignition. That's one thing we hear from the guys that really understand what they're building for long range rifles. When I'm talking guys that are building, I'm talking about gunsmiths that build the premium quality PRS type rifles and bench rest type rifles. That's the one thing that they will spend a lot of time messing with if it's not correct, because it makes a huge difference on the target. And
to double down, maybe to go into the bolt Ballraceway thing, you can still have excessive clearance and still have binding if the bolt and the bolt Ballraceway aren't cut true and uniform to each other. But also that vibration you're talking about, if there's excessive bolt clearance in the bolt Ballraceway, when you cock the bolt down, it lifts the rear of the bolt body up to the top of the action, removing the top front lug from making contact. And then when you fire, those things slam back down.
Yep. Correct.
And the front lug slams into the action and sends all those vibrations down the barrel.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
And then you go one step further, and I actually like this a lot. You don't make the actions and the bolt bodies out of the same materials.
No. So that helps with action slickness when there's different hardnesses. All stainlesses have a tendency to gall. It doesn't matter whether it's 416 or 17.4 or 15.5 or 303 or 304. The way the alloy is of stainless, it has a tendency to gall.
And you're talking stainless on stainless. So the stainless bolt body.
Stainless on stainless. Yeah, stainless on stainless is the worst combination. Mm-hmm. And that's why a person needs to be really careful when threading stainless barrels into stainless actions, that things are really clean and have some lube on them. But the stainless will gall as well to chromoly, but it's not as, it reduces the likelihood of it when you have the two different materials with the two different hardnesses.
Yeah, so you've got the stainless action chromoly bolt, and then doubling down on that, both are salt bath nitride, and again, adding to some surface hardness and helping to prevent that from happening as well.
Yeah, you'd have to use a hammer, I think, to close the bolt to make it gall after it's been nitrided.
You go through all of this process, and you make all of these parts yourself, I believe, for the action.
Mm-hmm.
How long does it take you from start to finish to, through all the process of all the heat treating and all coating, and from the time you start the process till an action is actually setting, ready to be shipped out to the customer. How long does it really take you to make an action like this?
If you were to just start one model of action and start with, it would probably take about 8 weeks to run from start to finish through the shop.
That's not actually that bad.
Operations.
And that's including the salt bath nitriding?
No, you got to have 3 weeks for that. Turnaround for that, shipping 2 directions and then their time.
But still, it's several months to make all the parts, get everything through the process, and then even just to ship out and start getting everything ready for salt bath nitride. Then it comes back from that and gets cleaned up again. Yeah,
normally they're pretty clean, but yeah, there's always a few holes and stuff that they leave some salts in, it seems like. So yeah, our assembly guys go through and make sure all that's cleaned up and then put them together.
The last thing I want to talk about actions here, and then I want to talk a little bit about the king of the 2 mile stuff and some of the different things that you guys do that's different. The head spacing thing is phenomenal. The other action manufacturers that we've talked to through the past, their head spacing, how we fit a barrel, we're now using the ACE system, but it measures from the bolt face to the top of the action. And I think a lot of times they don't want bothered with it because it holds them to tighter tolerances through the process. But I believe I caught a really good video where, they were really happy with the action that they were using, had, no more variances than 2 to 3,000. So making pre-fit barrels, could either mean a go gauge not going or being too tight or actually being too loose. In comparison to what you're doing, keeping that head space almost exactly the same, how close are your actions head spacing from action to action?
Plus or minus a half a thou.
I mean, that is absolutely phenomenal. I just can't say how hard or how much time has to be taken to make sure that happens. So we could take a barrel off of a rifle we built 8 years ago and take one of our barrels that we just finished and stick it on that action, and it's going to head space almost exactly the same.
Yep. The extra time is inspection. The guy that is machining bolt faces, he's inspecting every one of them and tweaking the tool offsets in the machine every few bolts. And same thing on the receiver when receiver's being machined. Receiver's a little easier to maintain because it's actually quite a bit easier because we're machining the face of the receiver at the same time the lug seats are machined. So that relationship stays the same throughout, the day. Mm-hmm. Whereas the back of the lugs are already machined when the bolt face is machined. And so that requires, like I say, he's monitoring every bolt and tweaking it throughout the day to maintain that headspace. He actually works to the guy that does those in our shop works. He actually is shooting for a couple tenths is what he's trying to maintain. He's just that kind of person, real picky. It really is, if you're going to claim a tolerance of plus or minus a half, you really have to work to half of that.
How many actions do you actually make? How many different models? And I know you've got a lot of stuff out there in the King of 2 Mile, but you got an idea?
Let me see. So in the bench rest, we make single shot bench rest actions. We're making 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I think 6, 7 different models from something as small as a 6 BR PPC up to the 50 BMG capable size actions. And then each one of those has submodels of different outside shapes and, of course, different ejection port configurations, different bolt faces. And then as far as the repeaters, we make the the VR is kind of the base model, short action Remington, and the HR is long action Remington footprint. And then we make sub models of those as well, and special models for Jamie and a few other guys that want just a few tweaks. But the bolts are basically the same as far as the internals of them. Just outside receiver shapes for the most part on those. And then we also make the Nuvo series of actions for Bullet Central, which is a horizontal lockup action on a full diameter bolt body. And so that's 2 more models that we make. So, yeah.
And I have a question for you. This is something that somebody wanted me to ask you. So, as long as you've been in building custom rifles, and you've probably heard this question asked, and so no better person in the world to ask and put it on the podcast here. If someone had to ask you a question, buying a factory rifle versus a custom rifle, why would you go custom?
Once you shot once you shot a supreme quality custom rifle, you'll never shoot a factory rifle again, because there is nothing like the confidence of knowing where every shot is going to go exactly. And that's the bottom line. I mean, it's just, to me, I personally don't own a single factory rifle. I take that back. I own a CZ 17 HMR. But every other rifle I have is one I've built for myself. And the reason that is because of the accuracy. I hate not hitting what I'm shooting at.
And there's something to say about, like, when you take a rifle out of the case. We see it at matches a lot where guys are shooting rifles they're not 100% confident in. And so they shoot a couple rounds down at a target at a stage. They miss, and they're not sure, was it me? Was it my gun? Was it my load? Is my scope off? I mean, you just slowly watch them start spinning like a dog chasing their tail. And in a matter of times, they got, foam running out of their mouths.
If you want to see a classic example of that, it's the worst guys in the world for that are actually the extreme bench rest shooters, the 100, 200 yard shooters. I mean, don't take offense, guys, if any of you happen to listen to this, but they will go and change their load after every target and swear it wasn't them or it wasn't the wind that bit them on that last group that was a 0.2 instead of a 0.1. Mm-hmm. They a lot of them guys get really wrapped up in losing confidence in their equipment. It's something that really screws you up. I mean, I've seen, we got a guy in the shop here. This is a quick story. He is the most, what we would do is we would give him our remainder of a box of bullets from Berger or Hottenstein or some of the other bullet makers. We'd have some left in the box, and it's like we were changing to a new lot. This is when Thom Dixon and I were shooting bench rest fairly actively. Him very actively, me never real actively. But anyway, we'd give him our leftovers. And then he goes to matches. I mean, he went to the Super Shoot one year, and he was in the top 10 until the last match, and his scope came loose. But he was shooting different bullets every other relay. He was just shooting whatever was left over. And, the gun shot great. And he didn't mess with his load. He was changing bullets just because he ran out of the other bullets. And, so it just reinforced to me that so many times we get wound up in thinking stuff's equipment, and sometimes it is. But when you're shooting premium equipment like, Krieger barrels, Bartlein barrels, bad actions, put together by a gunsmith that really knows what they're doing, most of the time it's the shooter and not necessarily their ability to shoot, but their ability to read wind and mirage and those kind of things.
And there is a lot to say for the mindset. Like if you go up to a stage and you shoot a shot or two, especially in the PRS type stuff, and you miss, and you can just say, well, that was me. You don't walk away from the stage losing confidence in your equipment or questioning it. Because as soon as you do that, that is a bad place to be in. Yep,
it is. And that's the difference between a guy shooting a factory rifle and shooting something that's built by a gunsmith that knows what he's doing. Because there's just a lot of things in factory rifles that aren't really completed. And they tend to bite you at the wrong time.
Is there any final thoughts that you'd like to share out there, or something you'd like to talk to people about, about Bat Machine, or what really separates you out from a lot of the competition or a lot of the new stuff that's coming on the market, which we're seeing tons of every day?
I don't know. We've never been much into bragging about ourselves, but I will say that in short range bench rest, I believe we own every record that's been set in the last 20 years now. And 1,000-yard bench rest, same thing. And the King of 2 Mile stuff, those guys are setting records with our stuff and winning the major matches with our equipment. Derek Rogers and Paul Phillips use our actions for that game, among others. But the PRS is a very crowded field, and we never really haven't really pursued it at all, but we do make actions that are very suited for it. And there's guys like Jamie at Wolf Precision that use them, and Mark over at Short Action Customs uses our actions for that game, among many other guys. But it's just not quite. We're not into just sponsoring every Tom, Dick, and Harry that comes along that thinks he's the top level shooter.
Right.
So we don't get much exposure compared to the guys that do that. But there's a foundation of in bench rest that cannot be discounted when you're trying to build extremely accurate rifle. And that experience we have and the design things in our actions, that all carries over into every extreme accuracy shooting sport. And it does make a difference. And we hear it all the time from gunsmiths that use our actions.
It's accuracy first. Like any component that you're working with, especially like here, it was always about accuracy first, making the best shooting rifle that you can, and not compromising on that end at all.
Right. And it's never been about quantity for us either, and that's the quantity we produce is definitely less than many others, even though we've been in business longer. It's always been about quality. The guys that I have working for me, most of them have been working for me between 15 and 20 years, and they really know their stuff. And it was hammered into them by me in the early days of what was required. And they do a really good job of maintaining that.
You just can't go out and buy a CNC and set it up and get that 20 years experience and start producing products.
Right. There's no substitute for experience, really, in any industry, not just firearms industry.
Yeah, especially when I think you're really, just trying to be the best. I do want to thank you a lot. I told you that I was going to make the interview about 20 or 25 minutes, and I went way over time, but it's just a lot of great stuff to talk about. And I think it's going to be really cool to share with a lot of the people what goes into making just that quality and level of action. I do, want to thank you for coming on and spending the time here at the podcast. And I do want to invite you back because we have this project that we've been working on together with the ACE system, Accurizing Chamber Extension, and a lot of the things that went into that. And there's some pretty cool stories behind it. But I think I'd like to save that for maybe a part 2 interview where we can talk about sort of what's going on from here in the future. But Bruce, I really do want to thank you for taking all this time, for coming on and sharing a lot of this great information with everybody. And a big thanks for all this time. I mean, an hour away from the shop's a lot.
You're welcome.
Well, there we go. That was a great interview with Mr. Bruce A. Thom of BAT Machine Company. And again, thanks, Bruce, for taking all the time and really sharing a lot of your experience with us here at the podcast. If you have any questions on anything that we talked about, of course, our website is wolfprecision.net. But also we want to remind everybody listening that our Facebook page is Wolf Precision Inc., where we post up a lot of videos and pictures and all these updates that we're doing here and along with Bat Machine. And we also want to invite you to check out our YouTube channel. We are doing lots of reviews on all the different parts and pieces, as well as some really nice stock reviews. We're going to be doing some optics reviews, just talking from a real-world shooter's point of view and sharing some of the pros and cons to the different options and choices when it comes to selecting some of the correct gear. So I want to say thank you for joining us. We are finally wrapping our 30th episode up and really excited to be on this long. And thank you all for listening and really making the podcast grow. We would like to ask, if you enjoy the podcast, to please leave some comments on iTunes and all of the other podcasting formats out there. It helps us out a lot because a lot of people will find us and look at the reviews, and that means a lot to us. Again, thank you everybody for joining us. My name is Jamie Dotson. I am your host, and you are listening to the Long Range Shooting and Custom Rifle Building Podcast.